We shall commence this module by discussing the economic system. Market and the governments are the two elements of an economic system. Markets are regulated by individuals who are the owners of resources and determine what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. It is a system that coordinates the production and consumption of goods and services through a price mechanism. The transactions between various market participants are voluntary and are targeted to maximize individual objective function. There is little government interference and competition among market participants regulates the economy. The government or the state, on the other hand, is an organization that uses coercive force to coordinate people's activities according to set rules and regulations. It takes responsibility of provision of goods and services that cannot be provided by the markets, such as public goods, social security, etc. The operation of these two institutions are interdependent, and success of an economy depends on how efficiently they coordinate and utilize economic resources. From Adam Smith to the neoclassical school, everyone recognized the importance of a free market system. Adam Smith argued that the presence of invisible hand and a free market system would drive the economy to the achievement of total economic welfare. He advocated the removal of trade barriers to improve efficiency in the resource allocation. Neoclassical economists such as Marshall Walras argued that price mechanism would ensure competitive equilibrium and maximum total utility, where wastes from unsold surpluses and unproductive efforts of looking for commodities in short supply will be avoided. However, markets are not able to achieve economic efficiency in all economic activities all the time. There is some dissatisfaction with the way markets operate. It is here where government intervention is required. The following sections will discuss the concept of market failure and the role of government in this regard. After studying this module, you shall be able to learn about the concept of market failure and various forms of it, know the role played by the government in correcting market failures and the functions performed by government in an economy. Let us now discuss about the market failure. The neoclassical school argued that markets result in microeconomic efficient outcomes. Pareto defines microeconomic efficiency, also known as Pareto optimality, as a situation where it is impossible to make one person better off without making someone else worse off. Market operations do not always result in microeconomic efficiency. Markets may produce too much of goods, may result in externalities such as air pollution, and may result in income disparities. Markets fail to achieve an optimum allocation of resources due to the presence of real life factors such as inertia, uncertainty, imperfect information, vagaries in aggregate demand, externalities, market power, and public goods, etc. Better in 1958 defined market failure as a failure of a system of price market institutions to stop undesirable activities where the desirability of an activity is evaluated relative to some explicit economic welfare maximization problem. Thus, even for efficient operation of markets, government intervention is required. In theory, government policy seeks to improve microeconomic efficiency by correcting a market failure. It is required to enforce property rights and contracts to ensure proper functioning of the markets. Before discussing the role of government in correcting market failure, it is important to understand the conditions under which markets fail to achieve microeconomic efficiency, or in other words, we can say there are 6 forms of market failure. First is failure of competition. Pareto efficiency or microeconomic efficiency requires presence of perfect competition, that is, large number of firms that cannot exert a force on prices. However, in reality, there are a large number of industries where only firms have the market economy, that is, there is presence of monopoly, oligopoly or monopolistic competition. These forms of competition violate the first welfare theorem that the competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. It requires that there should be perfect competition and the firms and the households believe that they don't have any impact on prices, that is, they act as price takers. Limited presence or absence of competition may be due to the presence of large firms with cost advantages compared to other firms, a case of natural monopoly. Imperfect information on the part of few firms and high transportation costs making it difficult for goods to be sold at many locations. Firms also engage in strategic competition to threaten entry of new firms. Monopoly power is also gained through government action such as grant of patents, copyrights, etc. We also know that imperfectly competitive firms set their marginal cost equal to marginal revenue to arrive at equilibrium setting, unlike under perfect competition where prices are set to equate marginal costs. Since under imperfect competition marginal revenue is less than the price, equilibrium output is less than the socially desirable or competitive output. It denies consumers the benefit of choices, impedes competition, and restricts production to create artificial scarcity and higher prices. The deadweight loss is lost to the society and is a social waste. Secondly, let's talk about public goods. Public goods have two properties, non-exclusion and non-rivalry. Non-exclusion implies it is impossible to exclude others from enjoyment or consumption of a good or service. For example, street light, defense, roads, etc. Non-rival consumption implies that consumption of a good does not affect the consumption of it by someone else. Such goods can be consumed or enjoyed by many in the same time at no additional cost. Private goods completely lack these properties, and markets can achieve efficient resource allocation only to private goods, as property rights are well established in case of private goods. Moreover, because of free ridership problem involved in the provision of public goods, private producers will not find it profitable to produce them. Under free ridership, there is the absence of voluntary payment for the consumption of the goods. Individuals refrain from payment, assuming that other consumers will pay for the goods. Thus, markets fail to efficiently supply public goods, and it provides a strong rationale for government provision of such goods. The third main point where markets fail is the concept of externalities. Markets fail in the presence of externalities. Externalities occur when production or consumption by an individual or firm affects the production or consumption of others either positively or negatively, and there is no compensation involved. For example, a chemical plant discharges pollutants in the river stream, imposing costs for downstream users of the river, such as fishermen. They may have to spend considerable cost on cleaning up the water. When such externalities are present, resource allocation by the market will not be efficient. Since producers do not take into account the full costs of negative externalities associated with their production, they tend to overproduce than the socially optimum. In the case of positive externalities, individuals do not enjoy the full benefits of activities generating positive externalities and thus engage in too little of these. Thus, government intervention is required to correct such market failures. The fourth point where markets fail is related to incomplete markets. It refers to the market failure that occurs when private markets fail in the provision of goods and services even though the cost of providing them is less than what individuals are willing to pay. Insurance and capital markets are the prime example of such market. In insurance market, there are not many private players because of certain important risks involved. In many countries, the government has taken active participation in the insurance sector. There are three important factors due to which such markets are imperfect. First is high transactions cost, that is cost of running the market, enforcing the contracts, cost associated with the introduction of new product. Next is innovations, the constant innovation of new policies, new products, new markets. And next is asymmetries of information and enforcement costs. Large gaps of information between the buyers and sellers of the quantities of a product and the risks involved. When there are asymmetries of information and enforcement problem, markets may not exist or the transactions may be smaller than the socially optimum. Hence, the government has to intervene in such markets to increase the quality of information to the market participants. Let's talk about complementary markets now. Governments intervene when there is an absence of coordination between different market players. For example, in developing countries, large-scale coordination is required between different agencies, businesses and policy makers, etc. The fifth main point, which represents where markets fail, is information failures. The welfare theorem assumes that market equilibrium price reflects all the information related to the relative scarcity of resources involved in the production of the products and the relative value placed on these products by the buyers. It is also assumed that all market participants have complete access to information. When this is the case, market prices plus the market environment reflects all the information needed to make socially optimal choices. However, we know that information is not equally available to all market participants. For example, consumers may not be fully aware of the relative merits of competing goods such as financial products. The insurance market is particularly prone to such information failures. The problem of adverse selection, where it is difficult to differentiate between high risk and low risk borrowers, causes such market failures. Thus, government intervention is required so that information is completely disseminated. Next point is unemployment and other macroeconomic disturbances. Relative high rates of unemployment, inflation are signs of problems with the market system. Economists such as Keynes argue that unemployment is an evidence of market failure and advocate government intervention for ensuring economic stability. Moreover, it has an important role in ensuring income equality and social security because the market as a system can ensure economic efficiency but at the same time can lead to unequal income distribution. The public policy becomes a necessity to secure objectives of high employment, price stability, and economic growth. It is also argued that individuals may not always act in their best interest and it may result in welfare loss. For example, people who smoke are aware of the ill effects of smoking, yet continue to smoke. Thus, government intervention becomes necessary in this regard. For example, imposing heavy taxes on cigarettes. Such goods fall in the category of merit goods. It calls for the public provision of some goods and restriction in the consumption of other goods. It is responsibility of the government to promote merit goods and to decrease the use of demerit goods such as smoking. Next, we shall discuss about the functions of the government. The government is required to ensure that the market outcome is in line with the preferences of the individuals and social economic goals of the country. It is required to guide, correct, and supplement the market, which cannot solely perform all the economic activities. For example, in the case of public goods or goods involving externalities, it enforces laws to regulate industry and control monopolistic behavior. It may also choose to provide goods produced under economies of scale such as water, railways, etc. The major functions of the government are classified into three categories. First is the allocation function. As discussed, markets fail to supply public goods. Public goods are collectively desired, whereas need for private good is felt individually. The markets can efficiently and optimally provide private goods where producers are guided by the consumer demands. However, in the case of public goods, the properties of non-exclusion and non-rivalry make market exchange operation inefficient. It would be inefficient to exclude anyone from partaking the benefits from the good. From here arises the problem of free ridership. Non-exclusion implies that people can refrain from making payment for the use of public good, assuming others are paying for it, and thus they can escape non-payment. The government, through imposition of taxes, can easily solve the problem of refusal of voluntary payment in case of public goods. The government must judiciously determine the amount of supply of these goods. Individuals may refrain from revealing their true preferences, and the government may resort to the voting process. Decision making through voting becomes a substitute of preference revelation, and taxes become a method of collecting cost shares. Thus, an approximate efficient solution can be achieved through government provision of public goods. Second is the distribution function. The study of economics deals with the efficient utilization of scarce economic resources given the distribution of income and pattern of consumer preferences. Income distribution depends on the distribution of factor endowments that in turn is determined by the process of factor pricing. Under perfect competition, the factors receive the payment equal to the value of marginal product. However, under imperfect competition, factors receive less than the value of marginal product. Moreover, even if factor prices are determined under competitive setup, it does not guarantee a fair distribution of income. It is difficult to compare individual utilities derived from their income, and moreover, redistribution policies may involve efficiency costs, that is, welfare losses associated with taxation and exchange in consumer and producer surpluses. Thus, the question, what constitutes a fair distribution, is a difficult one. It is here where the government has to play a critical role. Redistribution is implemented through tax transfer scheme, that is progressive taxation of high income groups and provision of subsidy for the low income group. Next is use of progressive taxation to finance programs targeted to benefit low income groups. Further, we can also use combination of taxes on goods consumed largely by high income groups and subsidies on the goods consumed largely by the low income groups. The policy makers, while choosing between the various instruments, must take into account the associated deadweight losses as they interfere with consumer choices. For example, an income tax may lead to distortion of choice between income and leisure. The ultimate objective must be to minimize the efficiency costs and ensuring a balance between equity and efficiency objectives. Third is the stabilization function. The allocation and the distribution function of the government exert significant influence on the macroeconomic variables of the country. The market functioning cannot ensure achievement of objectives such as high employment, price stability, sound balance of payment along with social economic welfare. The government assumes a greater role in augmenting the market for the achievement of desired macroeconomic goals. Without proper policies, economy of any country is subject to wide economic fluctuations such as unemployment and inflation. The Great Depression is one important example in this regard. It exposed the loopholes of the market system and exhibited the important role played by the government in revival of the global economy. In recent years, with growth of globalization, countries are even more vulnerable to the market fluctuations. The government can play an instrumental role in affecting the aggregate demand, which is the key parameter affecting employment level and the price levels. Aggregate demand depends upon income of the consumers, which in turn is dependent on factors such as present and past incomes, wealth, etc. These expenditures may be insufficient to ensure automatic restoration of full employment, or there may be conditions where expenditure may be more than the output, leading to inflation. In such scenarios, government action through expansionary or restrictive measures can restore equilibrium conditions. There are two policy instruments to deal with these problems. First, let's talk about fiscal instruments. Public revenue, public expenditure, and public debt are three fiscal policy instruments through which government can affect the level of aggregate demand. Tax reduction will lead to higher disposable income and thus will be instrumental in raising aggregate demand. Similarly, an increase in public expenditure can have an expansionary impact on public and private spending. Public debt, if utilized for improving productive capacity, will be fruitful for both present and future generations. Similarly, restrictive fiscal policy will help to achieve stabilization goals during the period of increasing aggregate demand and high inflation. Apart from fiscal instruments, the second type of instruments are monetary instruments. The level of money supply in an economy has an important bearing on the level of interest rates and thus on the level of investment, aggregate demand, inflation and exchange rates, and thus on overall economic stability. While an efficient market mechanism can achieve an optimum allocation of resources, but it cannot regulate the money supply. Money supply, if not properly controlled, can lead to adverse consequences. Thus, the central banks of country are authorized to take care of monetary policy through instruments of reserve requirements, open market operations, discount rate, etc. During periods of inflation, a tighter monetary policy can lead to a rise in interest rates and help to curb rising aggregate demand. Similarly, an expansionary monetary policy will lead to higher aggregate demand through a rise in liquidity and consequent fall in interest rates. Thus, the government activities have an important bearing on the state of economic activity and community welfare. The problems associated with market failure can be effectively corrected through a choice of government actions. But one must note that the government policies can err and can be inefficient. Care must be taken to take such inefficiencies in the account. There are two approaches to analyze the public sector activities. First is normative approach, focusing on what government should do, and second is positive approach, focusing on what government's actual activities and what are their consequences. First, let us talk about normative analysis. From our discussion, we know that under the presence of imperfect information, incomplete markets, public goods, externalities, and macroeconomic disturbances, and imperfect competition, markets fail to achieve microeconomic efficiency. Hence, a need arises for the government intervention. But one must take into consideration that when markets fail in presence of incomplete or imperfect information and incur huge transactions cost. So, the government would also not remain immune to such high transaction costs. Thus, such factors must be taken into account while formalizing a market failure correction strategy. Such intervention can bring about a Pareto improvement, that is, making someone better off without making others worse off. Second is positive analysis. Many times, market failure has been cited as a basis for identifying situations where government ought to do something. Many programs are designed just to justify market failure, and there exists divergence between program's objective and its design. Thus, care must be taken to ensure that program design is in line with its stated objective. Moreover, more focus should be kept on the consequences of government activities rather than on what it should do. Now, we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. The market is a system that coordinates the production and consumption of goods and services through a price mechanism. The government is an organization that uses coercive force to coordinate people's activities according to set rules and regulations. It takes responsibility of provision of goods and services that cannot be provided by the markets, such as public goods, social security, etc. Market failure refers to the divergence of market equilibrium from Pareto optimality. Government intervention is required to improve microeconomic efficiency by correcting a market failure. There are 6 types of market failures: imperfect information, incomplete markets, public goods, externalities, macroeconomic disturbances, and imperfect competition. The government functions are classified into 3 categories: allocation function, distribution function, and stabilization function. And lastly, there are 2 approaches of evaluating government programs: normative approach and positive approach.